What I want to do very briefly is focus a little bit on Monk's politics, or the question of politics in music. This is the only space where I can do that. There's other places where, you know, people want to know about the music, and to me, these things are inseparable, I mean, to be honest. But I want to talk a little bit about both the way that Monk was represented as a political subject, but also the politics in his being. I don't want to say in his music per se, because that's part of it, but part of what this book tries to do is tell you who the man is, who he is in relationship to his family, in relationship to the community he grew up in relationship to the political changing world around him, from civil rights to revolutionary struggles, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. And so I want to begin by reading a passage from the book, and it's an exchange between Monk and two journalists. One is Valerie Wilmer, and the other one's a man named John Hopkins. Both were active in the anti-war movement. Both were active, you know, Valerie Wilmer, who's still around, very much a radical feminist, socialist radical. And so they interview Monk. Okay, I have to put this down so I can hold the book, okay. And by the way, this passage was never published. This is from a cassette recording that Valerie loaned me very generously from the interview that became the basis for an article she wrote in Downbeat magazine. And so let me just read that passage there. Okay, from the book, and then also their interview. Okay, this is from the book. One of his more revealing encounters occurred on March 14th when Valerie Wilmer and John Hoppy Hopkins showed up at their suite at London's Park Lane Hilton, rain-soaked and toting cameras and a portable Grundig tape recorder. They were not your run-of-the-mill jazz photographers journalists. Wilmer was only 23 and yet had been writing for music magazines since she was a teenager. Hoppy was only 20 years old when he graduated from Cambridge University in 1960 with a master's degree in physics and mathematics. He gave up a promising career as a nuclear physicist to become a photographer. He and Wilmer met working for Jazz News and agreed that Thelonious Monk would make a good subject for the glossy men's magazine King. Besides an interest in Monk, Wilmer and Hoppy had something else in common. They were budding activists, passionately opposed to social injustice and war. Wilmer had a brief flirtation with the Young Communist League and increasingly became involved with anti-racist, anti-war, and radical feminist organizations, and Hoppy emerged as a key figure in Britain's radical underground and the peace movement. A month earlier, Hoppy had met and photographed Malcolm X during his short visit to England. On February 21st, 3 weeks before Wilmer and Hoppy's meeting with Monk, oh my God, it's a typo. Oh, now that sucks. Okay. Malcolm had been gunned down in Harlem's Audubon Ballroom. It says happy, it's Hoppy. Oh my God, I missed that one. Okay, second printing. For Wilmer and Hoppy, politics clung to them like the rain. Although most of their queries focused on music and they shared many lighthearted exchanges, their concern for world events compelled them to ask questions of a more political nature, producing some moments of tension, misunderstanding, and revelation. At one point, Wilmer asked Thelonious if he's interested in what's going on in the world. He replied, well, I got a wife and 2 kids, you dig, to take care of. So I have to make some money and see that they eat and sleep. And me too, dig? It's not my business what's happening with his family. I have to take care of my family. When Wilmer repeats the question with more precision, Monk becomes agitated and annoyed. I don't go around looking, no. I'm not interested in what's going on nowhere. The room is silent for a few seconds until Monk turns the table on his guest, blurting out, are you worrying about what's happening to everybody? Wilmer, not everybody, but some people. Monk, why you ask me that? Expect me to be worrying about what's happening to everybody. You not. You worrying about what's happening with everybody? Hoppy, sometimes. Monk, you worrying about what's happening with the person around the corner, the person next door? Hoppy, not everyone, but some. Monk, what if I ask you a stupid question like that? Something you don't do yourself. Wilmer, you can't care about every single person, but you can care about some people. Monk, but you asked me, do I care about what's happening to everybody around the corner? I don't be going around the corner. going to everybody's house, be looking to see what's happening. I'm not a policeman or a social worker. That's what your social worker should do. Hoppy, you're an American, I'm English. I get bothered about things my government does. Monk, well, I'm not in power. I'm not worrying about politics. You worry about politics. Let the statesmen do that. That's their job. They get paid for it. So if you want to be a politician, you be one. Stop taking pictures, be a politician. So it's interesting, this exchange is interesting, because what ended up in the article specifically was this idea that Monk wasn't really interested in politics, or that, or racism or the like. And in fact, he was quoted several times in other magazines, including an interview with Frank London Brown, where he basically says a version of the same thing. However, my book challenges these characterizations, and I portray a man who actually is politically engaged, is engaged both locally, nationally, and internationally. So how do we explain his response? For Monk, politics was a vocation, right? Politics was a vocation, just as he understood music as a vocation. Politicians do politics, musicians play music. And the other reason, which I'll touch on later, is that he often spoke starkly in very literal terms. I mean, he was making the point that he has enough to deal with when it comes to his own family, their needs and problems, that he doesn't have time or the inclination to help solve other people's problems. And yet, there were times in his life when he was really racked with guilt about his participation in the movement, wondering if he should do more. And he never expressed those concerns publicly, but privately he did. And at the same time, it's not as if Monk didn't care about social injustice. And let me just continue with that interview. So that exchange goes on, and this is from the book. I say, the exchange was unsettling, difficult, and yet incredibly painful and transparent. Rather than shutting Monk down, the challenges opened him up. He spoke about his incarceration. Quote, I know it's a drag to be in jail. And he lamented the brutal behavior of police back home. He says, quote, the police bothers you more in the United States than they do anywhere else. The police heckle the people more in the United States than they do any place else. You don't have as much trouble with the police in no other country like you do in the United States. The police just mess with you in the United States for nothing. They just bully people. They don't do that in no other country but the United States. They carry guns too, and they shoot people for nothing, okay? Now, Monk wasn't just speaking about himself, though part of what the book details is his run-ins with the police, is his beating in Delaware in 1958. But he's also dealing with something else. Quote, he was well aware of the rising incidence of police brutality in his own city, let alone other cities in the US. The previous summer, Harlem exploded when a white patrolman killed an unarmed 15-year-old boy named James Powell. The riot spread to Brooklyn, and his own neighborhood in San Juan Hill became pretty tense. It was impossible for any New Yorker not to be affected by Powell's murder and its aftermath. And like most Black Americans, Monk knew the problem wasn't limited to his beloved city. That same summer, incidents of police misconduct ignited riots in Rochester, Philadelphia, and Jersey City, okay? So when Monk says in this interview, I don't need to do a freedom suite, he's also making a case that his music need not be a commentary on social conditions, nor is it necessarily a mirror of its politics and social vision. I mean, there's other ways that he expresses the social and political vision, but it may not be specifically through his music. And yet there's ways that we can hear in his music that expression, even if it's not intentional. And so I begin this story, this book, with his roots in North Carolina. I spend an entire chapter on his history, going back to how his family coped with bondage. I go back to slavery and freedom and struggle for citizenship. And let me just read one short passage here. At the beginning of the book, I talk about the vestiges of slavery. More important than the memory of slavery, however, was the memory of freedom. The two generations that preceded Thelonious' lived through one of the greatest revolutions and counter-revolutions in the history of the modern world. Thelonious, his sister Marion, and brother Thomas were raised by people for whom freedom had tangible meaning. They heard first-hand stories of emancipation from their parents, stories of Black men going to the polls and running for office, of former slaves founding churches and schools, and helping to build a new democracy in the southern states. For any southern black person living between 1865 and 1900, freedom wasn't a word to be taken for granted or used abstractly. As Monk's parents in turn passed to him, freedom meant more than breaking the rules of musical harmony or bending tempos. His grandparents were part of freedom's first generation of African Americans, a generation that could dream of a good life under a hopeful democracy. Yet his parents watched that democracy and their freedom burn, sometimes literally, under assault by white supremacists as Jim Crow laws descended across the South. The disenfranchisement of black folk and the restoration of power to the old planter class was rapid and violent. Like many families, the Monks never lost their memory of post-Civil War freedom or the determination to possess it once again. Thelonious Monk's music is essentially about freedom. He inherited much from those who came before him, not least a deeply felt understanding of freedom. His story begins with their song. Just a couple other things before we, Monk was born in Rocky Mount, North Carolina in 1917. His roots go way back in East North Carolina to the 18th century. In 1922, his mother took the 3 kids and migrated to New York City, and for lots of reasons. One reason is because there was no high school in Rocky Mount for black kids, and so she wanted them to get an education. They moved in the San Juan Hill area of New York, which at the time had been the largest black community in Manhattan. It wasn't Harlem. In fact, people left San Juan Hill and moved to Harlem because there was better housing stock, and people live in dilapidated housing in the West 60s. And so in many ways, that experience is documented in the book. His experience with violence, both racial violence, intra-racial tensions between West Indians and African Americans, and most importantly, more than violence and repression, I focus on the way his mother instilled a sense of civic engagement, a sense of political participation. She was a member of the Democratic clubs in the mid-30s. She would make sure that they felt free to express themselves individually, and this had a profound effect on Thelonious Monk. He was also part of a community center, much like this, but it didn't have the same politics, but a community center in Columbus Hill Community Center that really was run by black professionals in the neighborhood, taught young people, teenagers, children, music, dance, art, elocution, all volunteers, by the way, in the community. That was Monk's life. Now Monk, as we know, made music his vocation, but it was as a working musician that he contributed to various social causes by playing benefits. Besides civil rights, at least half of the events he participated in were fundraisers. And I think this is important because a lot of those fundraisers are not documented. He did fundraisers for local community centers, fundraisers for hospitals like, in Harlem in 1948, and in Chicago in 55. He did a benefit for Paul Robeson in 1954 to get his passport back at a time when Monk himself didn't have a cabaret card to work. He did benefits for Harlem's Morningside Community Center. He performed for the UN Jazz Society in the UN's Year of Africa, inspired in part by the horrors of Sharpeville Massacre in South Africa. He did, of course, fundraisers for CORE, for SNCC, for Brooklyn's Bedford YMCA, and on and on and on. In August of '63, he appeared at this huge benefit concert at the Apollo Theater to raise money for the March on Washington. And I want to read a little section from that before I close, because part of what happens in this part of the book is that here's Monk doing a benefit for the March on Washington. Then he sees it on TV. He feels a little bit disconnected and almost, I wouldn't say embarrassed, but sort of thinking about what his participation is, and then something happens, which helps us understand what it means, or what I mean, when I say that for Monk, when he says he literally has to take care of his family, he means he literally has to take care of his family. Sometimes those crises loom larger than what is actually happening in Mississippi. Okay, and I just want to read that section for you, 340. Okay. Let me get some water here. Okay. On August 23rd, Monk appeared at the Apollo for another midnight benefit concert sponsored by the Negro American Labor Council. The purpose was to honor A. Philip Randolph and raise money in support of a massive march in Washington, scheduled to take place the following week. The proceeds were earmarked to pay transportation costs for thousands of unemployed workers, black and white, who wanted to attend the march. You know, many stars turned out, et cetera, et cetera. Thelonious was proud of his contribution, though a little ambivalent about not participating in the march on Washington. He did watch it on TV as he lay in bed. Harry Colomby, his manager, visited that day and remembers Thelonious suddenly announcing, "I think I made a contribution to the movement without having to be there to march." Whatever guilt Thelonious may have carried for not being on the front lines of the movement evaporated a week later when his nephew, Ronnie, Skippy's son, Skippy is his sister-in-law, Nellie, his wife, Skippy is Nellie's younger sister. And the song Skippy is named after her. Anyway, his nephew, Ronnie, Skippy's son, was found dead of a heroin overdose. Ronnie's death sent shockwaves through both the Monk and Smith families. For Toot and Boo Boo, his son, Thelonious Monk Jr., and Boo Boo Barbara, which is the daughter, who had just turned 10 3 days earlier, Ronnie had been like a big brother. Toot recalled that when they lived together on Bristol Street in the Bronx, and briefly on West 63rd Street, quote, Ronnie was the one that was sort of looking after me, you know? Clifton Smith, who was a cousin, felt the same way. And he says, quote, he was like my big brother, and he taught me all kinds of stuff, taught me how to talk to girls. Then, when he got involved with drugs, I couldn't follow him around. He used to tell me, don't do what I'm doing. Ronnie's death dealt a huge blow to the family because he was so promising, talented, and beloved. Skippy suffered something of a nervous breakdown and for months could not function. She went into seclusion. Thelonious took Ronnie's death especially hard. Most family members say it had a greater emotional impact on him than even the loss of his own mother. He was overcome more by anger than grief. Quote, I'll never forget the funeral, his nephew Thelonious recalled, because they called him Uncle Bubba, by the way. Uncle Bubba was mad. Services were held at a church in Harlem, and the minister kept saying that Ronnie was the nephew of Thelonious Monk and all that. It made him angry. He said, they're mentioning my name more than they're mentioning his. He stayed silent, seething through much of the service. When it was time to observe the body and pay respects, Thelonious leaned over the casket and began to trace crosses on Ronnie's forehead with his finger. During the interment, he could no longer hold back his emotions. For all of Monk's nieces and nephews, it was one of the most unforgettable moments of their lives. One of his nieces, Bonetta, recounts the story, quote, we were all standing around crying our eyes out, and Thelonious walked up to the grave and turned around and looked at us and said, all of you better not be so stupid as this. And he pointed to the grave and stormed away. I don't know how anyone else felt, but I was really, really angry. He knew we were hurting, and I didn't like him calling Ronnie stupid. He just died. It was the cruelest, hardest way to do it, but I tell you, it left an impression. Now, Ronnie's death sent Monk into a deep depression. He eventually came out of it, but Nellie said he wasn't the same after that. Never one to mince words, Toot put it this way, quote, Thelonious didn't handle death very well. He got nutty when his mom died. He got nutty when Ronnie died. And as if he needed another sign of how unjust the world suddenly seemed, just days after Toot and Boo Boo returned to their exclusive boarding schools, white terrorists bombed Birmingham's 16th Street Baptist Church on a quiet Sunday morning, killing 11-year-old Denise McNair and 14-year-olds Addie Mae Collins, Carol Robertson, and Cynthia Wesley. They were attending Sunday school. Several hours later, Birmingham's finest fatally wounded 16-year-old Johnny Robinson for throwing rocks at a passing car full of white teens yelling racial epithets and celebrating the church bombing. Negroes Go Back to Africa was scrawled on one side of the car in shoe polish, and a Confederate flag draped the other side. It was enough to make anyone go nutty. So in closing, because I really want to have a conversation about this, Monk's vision was rooted in the lives and struggles of his ancestors and elders who attempted to bring democracy to the U.S., nurtured in his mother's home and in the black communities of San Juan Hill, communities that were essentially under siege and shaped immeasurably by struggles around him. Now, contrary to myth, Thelonious Monk was not reclusive. He did not live in some other mystical world. He was very much of the world, at least until mental and physical illness caused him to withdraw, making his world seem much smaller. But for most of his life, he remained engaged and fascinated with his surroundings. Okay? Monk never set out to create what we might think of as political music or music that could inspire radical social change. In his own words, he simply wanted to create good music, music that, quote, that will get to people's ears, plus no criticisms from the musicians, that's the way he put it. And yet, he did inspire artists to look for new pathways to freedom, to break with the status quo. So even if Monk wasn't concerned about what's happening next door, his music may nevertheless have a profound impact, or it might not, and that is the question. So I will end there in this part, and let's have a conversation. Thank you.